it's basically going to be me talking about a new book that I co-edited with Fabian Muniza, just to plug it. And I've got another slide to plug it in a second, called Assetization, Turning Things into Assets in Technoscientific Capitalism, but also to talk a bit about a sort of example of where, how we're using, or how I'm using assetization, working with some colleagues, Troy Cochran and Callum Ward, to look at the assetization of data, basically, so digital. So look at assetization within digital capitalism. So I'll start off by talking about the book to provide a kind of conceptual groundwork framing for it. Then I will shift to the more kind of recent empirical research with my colleagues. So just to kind of, there you go. There's the MIT Press kind of publicity shot. It says buy now, but actually it's free. So if you're interested, you can go and download it, open access from the MIT Press website. You just need to search assetization. It should be the first hit on Google. And yeah, you can find it open access there on the MIT Press website. So you don't have to pay anything for it, which is great. So to start then, so this is a project that came out of a series of conference sessions at the 2016 4S East conference in Barcelona. So Fabian and I set up this panel called Turning Things into Assets. We had a really good response, an unexpectedly good response, and so we ended up with about 5 panels at the conference. And so we decided that it makes sense to try and do something with this. 4 years later, academic terms, that's pretty quick, we have a book. I think it's a really great book, obviously, and I think it's got some really great chapters in it. There's chapters for everyone, because it's an edited collection, so there's chapters on various different things, including intellectual property, data, personal data, healthcare, railway infrastructure, renewable energy, mineral deposits, seed varieties, natural capital accounting, higher education debt, and then social impact bonds. So it's got a range of different examples of what we're calling, this assetization process. So if any of those interest you, then you can go and download any of the chapters you want to read, and they're free, as I said. So I'll start off with talking about assetization as this concept, and then I'll do this, as I said, I'll do an example by looking at digital capitalism, personal data. So the book is premised on the idea that contemporary capitalism is different. It is increasingly defined by its kind of technoscientific characteristics, whether that's new kinds of products, services, specialty, scientific specialties, or the increasing dominance of particular kinds of innovation, narratives, social actors, institutions, and so on. We don't think this is necessarily new. People have been talking about technoscientific capitalism in different forms, at least since Jean-Francois Lyotard in The Postmodern Condition. But we think there's something is different in the sense that contemporary capitalism is increasingly dominated by this asset form. So rather than being dominated by, say, commodity form, we think that the asset form better reflects what's happening. And in part, this is because of a range of different sort of technoscientific sort of developments, I guess. So things like the kind of emergence of unicorns, these large private companies worth over $1 billion who've never made any profit or revenues, but also we can look at things like the biopharmaceutical firms that are buying back their shares to ramp up their share values at the same time as they are increasing the price of drugs. Also, think about things like the kind of the government creation of climate emission entitlements that get sold then as these kinds of assets and so on. So something new is happening that is technoscientific, capitalistic, and we think the asset form is a good way of representing this. So what do we mean by this asset form? So an asset is something that can be owned, controlled, owned or controlled, traded and capitalized as a revenue stream. And this often involves forms of valuation of discounted future earnings in the present. And this discounting often reflects assumptions about the future value of money, framed around inflation, risk, uncertainty, and so forth. And the whole point of this asset, of creating an asset, is to gain a durable economic rent from it rather than selling it in a market. So it's about value. It's about extracting value through this ownership and control of this asset, particularly by limiting access to it. And our point is, and this is why it's this is our engagement with the asset form through STS lens. Our point is that these assets are made; they're constructs. They're not inherent or embodied, inherently. They don't merge as some sort of natural form. They're not embodied as some sort of natural quality, and so on. And so the intent of the book is to show how these assets emerge through this assetization process. The process assetization describes these creation of these assets. Now, there are different ways of understanding what an asset is. I've just provided briefly a definition, but lots of people understand assets in different ways. There are different kinds of, depending on the kind of ontological, epistemological basis or assumptions that people have. So an accountant might see an asset in certain forms. Sorry, I have to plug in my other computer because I've got my notes on that one, and it's about to run out of battery. Well, a business person might see, like an accountant might see it in the form of assets and liabilities. A financial analyst might see it in terms of kind of securities, the investment portfolio they have. And the average homeowner might just see it in terms of the kind of house that they've got and the future that they create through the ownership of their house. In technical terms, an asset is according to the International Accounting Standards Board, an asset is, to quote, a resource controlled by the entity as a result of past events and from which future economic benefits are expected to flow to the entity. So there's very specific kinds of accounting qualities there around, it is a resource, productive therefore, controlled, that you've acquired somehow, and that has these expected future benefits. Now we can, in the book, we discuss some of the connections between the asset form, and other kinds of notions of critical notions of or concepts that have been applied to contemporary capitalism, like capital itself, capitalization, financialization, and such like. And we differentiate between them in various ways, and you can go and read that if you're interested in our discussion of those sorts of things. But they're not such. I don't think they're so vital here today. But what we think sets the asset form and assetization apart from these from other ways of understanding contemporary capitalism is the fact that they're characterized, assets and assetization is characterized by 7 kind of sort of aspects or characteristics, I guess. The first being that assets are legal constructs, in the sense that their ownership or control rests on forms of state enforcement of property or control rights. So it's not just simply property and ownership. And often assets can entail a separation of the rights themselves from the thing that they enable control of. A second kind of aspect of assets and assetization is that the assets involve distinct modes of ownership or control. And so this is different from, say, the kind of commodity form, where the asset form enables forms of exclusion rights to the use of an asset or its derivatives after you've sold a copy, for example. So sort of flow-through rights that enable asset holders to control the use of the derivatives or the copies of the asset itself. And the classic example that people have used is tractors. So tractor manufacturers are increasingly stopping farmers from changing or repairing their tractors through the kind of license agreements that farmers sign around the software that's increasingly dominates kind of tractor usage. So the asset holder can control what you do essentially with the object or the product that you're using. A third aspect of assets then is around this fact that this form of control, which you could think of as monopoly control, involves forms of rentiership. And so this is about the extraction of value through this control over the asset itself. A fourth kind of aspect is the fact that as a result of these kind of monopolies, the construction of these monopolies, assets have very distinct supply and demand logics. So rising asset prices do not necessarily enable or lead to new producers entering a market and thereby lowering the price. So instead you have constant increases in the value of the asset. Fifth, asset values can be discounted in light of forward-looking expectations about future returns on investment, whether or not those expectations are actually met. And so this is why you have these massive valuations of big tech companies at the minute. They expect the valuation is based on the expectation of future return, but we don't know whether that's going to happen. And this leads to all sorts of problematic social outcomes, as we can think of these in relation to housing more, on a more everyday basis. The consequence of thinking of housing as an asset leads to rising housing prices, and this prices people out of certain markets and so on. Six, the price and valuation of assets is subject to the actions and the decisions of the owners themselves. So it's not simply a kind of automatic, economic process, as it were. Owners, controllers are engaged in managing the value of their assets. And that means finally that the valuation, the value of assets is a dynamic thing. It's managed through social relationships, basically. So I'll just give you a summary of the kind of, starting points of our thinking about what, the asset form is and what assetization is. We then trace out the lineage of this kind of intellectual lineage of the asset form in the book by looking at the discussion of assets by various different disciplines, and we can trace it back to at least the late 19th century, the sort of heterodox economic thinking of people like Thorstein Veblen, and then the early 20th century, the more kind of orthodox thinking of people like Irving Fisher, and then during the 20th century, you can see the discussion of assets proliferate within kind of economics and other kinds of disciplines as well, and gets taken up critically in the kind of more constructivist disciplines later on. So there's discussions of assets and so on in cultural economy, anthropologies of finance, heterodox political economy, economic geography, critical accounting, sociology of capitalism, and then STS. And I think STS has taken a particularly, increasingly taken a kind of leading role in trying to unpack and understand what assets are in the assetization process. So how things are turned into assets, the various sort of socio-technical, techno-economic devices or knowledge claims or narratives and so on that are part and parcel of this process of transforming something, almost anything really, into an asset. And so in STS, you have examples of discussions around intellectual property, the creation of intangible assets, a lot of discussion about that, but also discussions about, say, human capital, business models, valuation practices, a lot of work on that, personal health data increasingly as well. And so a lot of this scholarship in STS is about trying to engage with understanding how future value gets constructed in the present through, as I said, these kind of techno-economic processes, practices, knowledge claims, etc., etc. And this is all, as we understand it, in STS, this is all socially organized. And so we need to understand how we go about constructing assets, how we create the boundary of what an asset is, how do we understand the accounting of assets and the construction of accounting standards to delineate what an asset is from what an asset is not, and so on. And so we can take these apart, these claims, these social practices, these technical devices, and so on, to understand their role in this. So after doing that in the book, we then try and trace out a few kind of continuing problems or paradoxes and open questions that we think are important, that haven't been, that need to be addressed when it comes to assetization. Starting with the distinction or the difference between the kind of financial valuation when it comes to assets versus the kind of the critique of, if you like, the critique of markets. So financial valuation is, it's a different thing. It's about investment and so on. It's not so much about the, the commodification and marketization of things. So there's a different sense in which we're trying to get at some of the problems of capitalism, which often involve much more abstract kind of processes that we need to unpack in order to understand what's going on when we start valuing the the kind of expected future revenues of something and so on. And there's some interesting work here around, in the STS context, around the ways that high-tech firms outsource a lot of risk in their kind of innovation processes. So we've seen that a lot with biopharmaceutical companies, but we're also seeing it with big tech. So the valuation of big tech is dependent upon them getting rid of the risks that they take in development. So they they try and outsource those risks, the uncertainties, in order to ensure that the valuation of their companies is not affected by these unknowns. And so that's where I think that's my argument would be, that's where you see an increasing like you've done with biopharmaceuticals, the increasing kind of proliferation of startups and a kind of startup ecology in which companies start up and then expect to be bought out by big tech. So that's the kind of the kind of innovation ecology that has emerged. A second kind of issue is around the difference between thinking like an investor and thinking like an entrepreneur, what this means when it comes to contemporary capitalism, and what are the implications of these different ways of thinking. So this builds on what I've just been saying around the kind of ecology, innovation ecology, if you like. So the idea being that as an entrepreneur, you might be more focused on producing new products, services, markets, what have you. But as an investor, you're really just thinking about you're getting your return back. And so the implications of this for the way we run our economies are quite significant, because you end up with a very different set of ways of seeing the world, as it were. And so innovation, I've written about with some colleagues, written about the problem of innovation, where the problem of innovation is the fact that innovation is now designed to extract value or capture value rather than create value, in a sense. The third kind of set of issues around the difference between the private profit and public interest. So the problem of the insertion of these kinds of asset investor logics in public sector management, planning, and such like, and what are the implications of these kinds of ways of understanding the world when it comes to making long-term political policy decisions. A good example being nuclear waste. How do we understand the management of nuclear waste? And if we understand it in terms of an asset, how do we go about paying for the disposable nuclear waste? And thinking about it in these kinds of asset terms leads to particular kinds of approaches to disposal, where you are locking in future generations to a particular policy that is created now with very little redress for them in the future. A fourth or fifth kind of set of issues is around the fourth set of issues around the kind of difference between the material and immaterial kinds of assets. So what are the implications of these specific socio-materialities of assets when it comes to thinking about their asset, this transformation of things into assets, the assetization? What are the differences between things that, or the differences in assetization when it comes to differences in shape or size or tangibility, corporeality, all these sorts of things when it comes to that, how easy is it to convert something into an asset. We think that, with the right kind of techno-economic configuration, almost anything can be turned into an asset. So these are kind of interesting questions when we're thinking about the range of things. And then a final set of issues in the book that we highlighted around the shift away from kind of ownership and property towards more kinds of contractual licensing arrangements when it comes to, comes to the governance of political economic things. And so there's a shift in the way that entities are controlled, but economic entities are controlled away from property rights to more kind of contract law rights, represented by things like license agreements and subscriptions and such like. So the increasing dependence on those sorts of things. Okay, so that's the just kind of intro to the discussions in the book. And so what I wanted to do now is try and provide an example to kind of represent what's, how does this play out? How do we understand this assetization in a kind of real world situation? And so the example I've got is work I've been doing with some colleagues, Troy Cochran and Callum Ward, about looking at personal data and what we originally thought of as the kind of assetization of personal data. And so personal data here, this is the World Economic Forum talking about personal data. What personal data has been sort of presented, imagined as the resource of the 21st century. And so the World Economic Forum, this is 10 years ago now, produced this report called Personal Data, the Emergence of a New Asset Class, in which they said, and quote there on the right, so this massively increased amount of personal data is generating a new wave of opportunity for economic and societal value creation. So they have this idea that this personal data is leading to this key resource of the future, leading to this new kinds of social and economic value. And we can see these kinds of notions also appear in the work of scholars like Shoshana Zuboff, whose book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, has been incredibly influential over the last couple of years in debates around digital capitalism. She's called personal data she's also called it a new asset class, where, to quote her, every casual search, like, and click is claimed or was claimed as an asset. So this is kind of the reason for looking at personal data, is this idea that personal data is this new kind of asset class. It's very important, and there's an important kind of transformation of personal data into this economic asset. I have a personal link here. I have a piece of art which is called The Emergence of a New Asset Class, by a local Toronto artist, Tony Taylor, and I bought this, I don't know, almost 10 years ago, on the basis of having read the World Economic Forum report and found it particularly funny. And so I just added that here. A light break, I guess, piece of, yeah. So why does this all matter? Sorry, I might be getting ahead of myself. But just before we get to why it all matters, I'm just going to talk a little bit about personal data and digital personal data in particular. So personal data itself has been defined as information relating to identifiable natural persons. It's often differentiated between sort of identifiable, personal data, or personal identifiable information, and then anonymous data, and then pseudonymous data, and the difference between them being to do with the amount of how easy it is to connect to an individual and the kind of collection process. But increasingly, anonymous, pseudonymous data is becoming increasingly identifiable as a result of various technical processes, tracing back from one set of data sets to another set of data sets, for example, or connecting up one set of information to another set of information. So they're increasingly, I think, kind of becoming conflated with one another, if you like. So I think we can treat them relatively similar. Now, there's a long history to personal data, so a lot of it connected to credit scoring, especially the data collected by data brokers like Experian, that are, it's about trying to rank people's credit, their credit credibility. So this is, the collection of personal data has been going on for a long time. But I think I and others think there's a difference because of the digital nature of it now. So people like Barbara Prainsack highlight the 4 V's, I think they're known as, so volume, velocity, variety, and value. This is the difference that with the collection of digital personal data, where there's a massification of this data collection, use, and exploitation. So it's not the same as this earlier credit scoring and data collection by data brokers. There are also different or new kinds of technical objectives and structures of collection. This is something Julie Cohen has written about. So, new patterns of, the interest in collecting data on patterns of online attention. How many times, what websites do we go and look at? What do we search for? All these sorts of things. And there are new logics of use as well. So this is Salome Villion recently talking about the kind of inferential predictions that this massification of data enables. So it's not necessarily about the individualized, precise kind of influencing of behavior and such like that matters here. It's more about the, having so much data that you can make reasonable predictions about the actions of an individual or group and so on. And this is all dependent upon the, the mass of data, basically. And so this is all, why all this matters and what's the relevance of this, I guess, to the real world, if you like. But this is really a big public policy debate right now around, what is the role of big tech in our societies, or what should the role be of big tech in our societies, and what is the role of data collection, digital data collection in our societies, and the use of digital data, and the exploitation of it, and who should be able to do it, what kind of data should companies and others be able to collect and use and exploit, and this, I think, has been something that's emerged over the last 4 or 5 years. Has been described as the tech clash by the Financial Times commentator Rana Faruha, and it's a growing kind of concern around this use of personal data, and it's evident in the Canadian context, at least in the recent piece of legislation the federal government put before Parliament in, I think, the end of 2020, called the Digital Charter Implementation Act, which is around trying to firm up some of the uses that companies can, the uses and exploitation of personal data that companies can, the exploitation of personal data that companies are allowed to do, and the use that they're allowed to, the data they're allowed to collect and use and so on, and what kind of data they're not allowed to collect, and what kind of rights we as individuals have to contest what data they're collecting and such like. And I think this is going to become more and more important over the next few years. So the project we were doing, Troy Cochrane and Callum Ward and I, was around thinking about the assetization of this personal data, digital personal data. And so we started off with thinking, let's look at, let's look at these data assets, as people have called them, new asset class. Let's look at them by looking at the big tech firms and looking at their asset bases, and to see, how have these asset bases changed over time? How are they being valued? These digital data assets being valued, and what are the implications for the massive increase in value of big tech over the recent past, which you can see here just in this graph. So the market capitalization of the big 5 there, which has just outpaced everyone else on the stock market, basically. Like, to a massive extent, it's outpaced everyone else in the stock market. So we were interested in, how is this personal data being valued, basically, on the balance sheets of these firms. And so we started looking at the firms and their asset bases, and found that it was really difficult to identify anywhere that personal data might sit on these in these kind of balance sheets of these firms, these big tech firms. And it was even more surprising. It seemed to be that these firms had a lower proportion of intangible assets than other firms on the stock market. So by a significant amount. So it seemed like they had fewer intangible assets and actually were investing more intangible assets. So we were kind of confused about what's going on here. How do we understand this from this notion of assetization and this kind of idea that personal data is going to be this new asset class that drives the economy and drives these big tech companies. And so we started looking at how big tech firms and their investors sort of understand the value of their firms, or the kind of asset base of their firms, in order to try and get at how do they what is it that they are turning into an asset. What's interesting here is that they focus more on, rather than personal data, they focus more on users and user engagement and key kinds of metrics like that. So they're not so concerned with this idea of personal data. And in fact, when you look at the earnings calls, which is the discussion between financial analysts and the firms themselves, the analysts will then make judgments about how investable that firm is, and so they have quarterly meetings with these big tech firms, and they ask questions and so on. So we analyzed 10 years worth of these earning calls between the analysts and the 5 big tech firms, and personal data came up, I think it was twice in that time. So doing a kind of quantitative analysis of the discourse that was going on, personal data was mentioned very little, but it was user engagement, monetization were the key kinds of ways that the analysts and the big tech firms are framing the discussion. So as users were the kind of key asset here. So then we were trying to determine if it's not personal data and it's users, then how do we understand the governance of users as an asset? How do we understand the valuation of users as an asset? And trying to think through ways of doing this to try and understand what's going on. And we started thinking about some of the work by people like James C. Scott, whose book "Seeing Like a State" has been influential for a number of people discussing sort of digital capitalism and so on. And after reading it, we thought that it says something here which is important about this transformation of users into assets. And we kind of think of this as a form of tech craft. So rather than statecraft, it's big tech engaging in various forms of various practices that enable the transformation of users, user engagement, usage, whatever, into things that are legible and measurable by big tech, by their investors, as something that is valuable. And this enables them to govern these sorts of things and to make them valuable. So what we argue in the paper we're currently revising this resubmission is that so user data has been assetized in very specific ways, constituted by forms of governance based upon sort of data ecosystems, if you like. So it's not about owning personal data, which you can't do. It's about understanding and making users measurable and legible through different forms of metrics and standardization. So identifying them in the first place, identifying usage through these metrics and standards. And secondly, then it's about configuring the collection of this data through the ecosystem itself. Thirdly, it's about the enclaving of these users and user data through forms of contractual and technical devices, so things like terms of service agreements, interoperability restrictions, limits, those sorts of things. And then it's about trying to claim future revenues through different forms of extractive mechanisms. And this might be locking in the users to an ecosystem like Apple does. You buy a device, an Apple device, you're tied into the rest of the kind of Apple ecosystem. But it might be also about forms of subscription to services like Microsoft, tying into these kinds of services delivered by Microsoft. It might be about selling access to the users themselves and the usage data, like Facebook and Google, through advertising. Or it might simply be about collecting a range of fees for the use of the platform itself, like Amazon. So there are different ways that these firms are doing things, but they're still all involved in this extraction, and as well as the kind of transformation of users into something measurable, legible, and governable. And there's the key kind of the key kind of metrics are users, usage, user engagement, and the key kind of way of governing and making them valuable is through access to these users and information about their usage and their engagement. So these firms are, as I said, they're identifying the users and their user engagement. So it's not about accounting for personal data as some form of intangible asset. And this enables them to be, on the one hand, to be governed, so the users need to be governed, but on the other hand, you need to monetize the kind of user engagement, or their user engagement. And so we can look at, we can sort of understand this by looking at both the earnings calls, but also looking at the discussions of acquisitions, mergers and acquisitions made by these companies, and their understanding of what's valuable about the companies they're buying. So Facebook buys WhatsApp, Instagram, Microsoft buys LinkedIn, other firms buy other firms, and so on. And here there's a lot of emphasis on, it's not just users, it's user engagement. So user clicks, click-through rates, things like this. All these are considered to be valuable assets, essentially. And then it's about trying to monetize it, as I said, through those kinds of extractive mechanisms. And this is all dependent upon forms of governance that rely upon, essentially rely upon us, signing over, our, signing over the right for these companies to use our data as they see fit in perpetuity, essentially through these terms and contractual arrangements and contracts that we often don't read. So one of our colleagues at York, Jonathan Obar, has written about this, about the kind of biggest lie on the internet being that no one reads these agreements, but we sign over all our rights to them, basically. And so we're locked into it, this kind of perpetual, as I think Foucault and Klutz have said, of this Malthusian bargain in which we have a supposedly reciprocal exchange in which locks, to quote them, locks users into a perpetually renewed transactional cycle in which consent is assumed forever. And so we have this kind of process in place. So really, then it's about it's about assetization here is about users, usage, user engagement, and there's all this stress upon these kinds of key aspects of of the data collection, basically. And so the metrics are incredibly important, making things understandable, legible, so that they can be governable and made valuable. And so you have these metrics that are things like daily active users, monthly active users, user base, all these things that get discussed in these earnings calls and reports, and a key for making the the users legible as an asset that can then be made valuable. And around the, as I said, this collecting data through these perpetual consents, basically, from which they can then generate revenue streams. And the important thing is here, it's about trying to create this kind of enclave or ecosystem enclave, which then becomes insurmountable as some form of data monopoly that they can control and just continue collecting more and more data. Now, what's important here from this sort of STS perspective is that the user is a techno-economic object. So a user is not a person. It reflects, reflects a series of technological, socio-legal choices. It's about contract rights that are involved in privacy agreements, arrangements. It's about technical kind of limits to interoperability and so on. And these both construct the use and usage, or they construct the use and the user of these digital ecosystems. And they make, and in so doing, that's how they make them legible or measurable to the big tech and their investors. And there are interesting ways of doing this. So one is the standardization of something that Tim Huang called an attention asset, which is the construction of a standard for our attention to the screen, essentially. And this standard has been defined as kind of viewable impression, to quote him, which is framed as follows. And again, this is a quote from Tim Huang. A viewable impression is more than 50% of pixels in an advertisement must occupy the viewable space of a browser window for greater than or equal to 1 continuous second after the advertising renders. And so this is a way of standardizing what is valuable here, and what is measurable and what is legible, and therefore what can be made valuable. So you have this kind of way of standardizing things through these metrics. And so as this implies, so someone who's not making a viewable impression, you're using an ad blocker, for example, no longer becomes legible or measurable as a user. And the use itself, this use then ends up mattering in terms of how we understand what a user is and how they engage with digital technology, and how they're constructed as users by the ecosystems themselves. And so use itself can be seen as a form of performative recursive construction of a legible and measurable user, as understood by big tech, through the development of particular kinds of digital technologies and political economies, things like constant scrolling, autoplay, ecosystem lock-ins, that specifically are designed to generate users who make viewable impressions. So that's what it's designed to do. All of this feeds then into the kind of concern, big tech's concern with user engagement, measured by these daily active users, monthly active users, and the revenues they generate measured by things like average revenue per user. So it's not, our argument is, to finish, is not that personal data is not turned into an asset, some form of capitalizable property. It's users engagement, but in a particular way. So people are turned into users through these standards, through these kind of metrics. They're made legible and measurable to big tech, to their investors, in a way that reinforces the market power of big tech and their control over the access to these users, and the technological developments that they engage in that maintain and augment the active use of big tech's ecosystems. So I'll finish there. Obviously, I haven't dealt necessarily with implications, but we can do that in discussion perhaps.